afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to today's Greenhouse Gas Coordination Working Group 11 call. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be assisting with today's meeting. Today's slide deck presentation is available on the initiative webpage, and you can get to that page by going to CAISO.com, and then under the Stakeholder Center tab on the home page, you'll see Policy Initiatives. If you click that link, it'll take you to our main initiative landing page where you can search for the initiative webpage. This meeting is being recorded and the video file will be posted to the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And if you need any technical assistance at any point during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer. To ask questions during the meeting, you can open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right, and you can raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon at the bottom, or if you joined audio only, press *3 on your device. For anyone joining us today, please state your name and affiliation first before speaking, and you may also send comments and questions via chat to all participants. And just a reminder that commissioners and advisors from state public utility commissioners may be in attendance today. And next, I'll turn it over to Isabella to go over the agenda.
Thanks, Christina, and again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So the agenda for today, I'm going to kick us off by just going through what to expect, and then I have some slides summarizing stakeholder feedback we received from the last working group in May. And then following that summary, I'm going to turn things over to Sylvie, Mahir, and Anya, and we'll get an update on the GHG metrics requests and the EDM GHG Go Live monitoring. We'll take a quick break and then we'll come back and hear from the Regulatory Assistance Project. So we have Andrew Valanis, Carl Linville, and Commissioner Lisa Tawney joining us today, and they'll be going over the GHG subgroup initial perspectives on key discussions in energy markets. And then we'll wrap up today's discussion with Anya. She's going to go over the non-price GHG approach, and then we'll cover some next steps. So before I jump into our first item, are there any questions on the agenda today? Okay.
There are no questions, thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. All right, so this is our graphic just showing where we are at in the working group process. So we have moved forward towards that resolution and discussions on the stakeholder proposed recommendations. So moving out of that assessment phase into the resolution space. Next slide. And you can jump ahead one more. Okay, so to summarize the stakeholder feedback we received on Oregon's perspective on emissions tracking and accounting, that was one of the presentations during the May working group. The general theme here was that there was appreciation for the proposal of that in-market constraint, but at this time, the majority of stakeholders who submitted comments are prioritizing a tracking and reporting framework first. But there is support to continue discussions exploring the concept of that in-market constraint as a long-term approach. And then I will note that 6 cities did voice disagreement on the necessity of an emissions constrained dispatch for EDM compliance, and WPTF kind of challenged the necessity of that emissions constrained dispatch for Oregon's GHG targets, noting utility support for alternative proposals. Next slide. All right, so the discussion on mechanics and examples of the emission constrained dispatch approach, the general theme here was that stakeholders are still in favor of developing that tracking and accounting or tracking and reporting approach prior to the in-market dispatch solution, but again are still open to further discussion and analysis of the in-market solution to address some of the outstanding questions and concerns that exist. So some of those concerns focused on feasibility, cost effectiveness, the introduction of a GHG shadow price in a non-based program or non-price-based program, being able to quantify and communicate emissions allowances within BAAs, and also FERC approval for BAAs in states without emission caps. So those were some of the concerns still that stakeholders are seeking more discussion on. Next slide. All right, so in terms of moving the discussed approaches for non-price-based state to policy development, again, this is kind of the theme that you'll continue to hear today, is that there was a lot of support to move the WPTF approach forward to policy development. And again, just acknowledging that it could be complementary to an in-market approach. But again, more discussion and analysis is needed on that in-market solution before we're ready to move that into the policy development discussions. Next slide. All right, so moving into the feedback on the ISO's GHG price formation presentation. Generally, there was a desire for more discussion and clarity on the current GHG price formation, and also support to explore alternatives to the current paradigm, or having further discussions on a separate metric for GHG costs, or additional data for stakeholders regarding the GHG costs. Next slide. All right, so the ISO's EDM GHG regulation model examples. So PGP really encouraged examples and discussion on the GHG adders and the implications for future state program linkage. PGP emphasized the importance of understanding the market design considerations with and without linkage under EDAM. And the WPTF voice challenges or challenged the representation of marginal GHG costs, and really called for the expanded modeling to include all resources for better price formation discussions. So stakeholders are seeking a little bit more discussion there. All right, so in terms of the ISO's GHG counterfactual presentation, some themes here were that stakeholders voiced concerns related to cost impacts on the GHG regulation areas and are looking for further analysis of this issue. Others are also interested in further discussions on this topic to kind of, one, understand the mechanics behind the GHG award limitations in secondary dispatch, and then two, seek additional clarity on discrepancies between eligible attribution and GHG awards under specific scenarios. DMM did note that the GHG reference path in EDAM may be a better counterfactual for analyzing leakage, but it does involve trade-offs in market outcomes, and encourage the ISO to work with GHG regulators to understand those trade-offs. Next slide. All right, and our last slide here on feedback. So we asked stakeholders for suggested topics for future working groups, or items that were ready to move into the policy development phase. So I'll run through here line by line, but NVE supported initiating a stakeholder process to establish state-specific reports showing how the market impacts GHG goals. PG&E requested analysis of cost-benefit of secondary dispatch constraints on the cap and trade affordability in collaboration with CARB. PGE had a few recommendations, so one being operationalizing the WPTF proposal, including implementation by the ISO or other entities. So we'll be discussing that a little bit later on today. Availability of emissions data to stakeholders. Again, as I mentioned, we do have an update on the metrics piece of the working group today. So, so we will have some items to update you all on related to that. Again, for PGE, allocation and management of implementation costs. And then also, they support the emissions constrained dispatch proposal, but really emphasize the need for significant design work, advancing and additional discussions to answer some of those outstanding questions and concerns. PGP would like to further develop the GHG price formation and GHG counterfactual, and so they think there's more discussion to be had there, and are seeking specific examples and some answers to some key questions. SRP advocates for improvements that benefit entities with corporate GHG reduction objectives alongside those state mandated programs. So again, emphasizing those corporate objectives. And then 6 cities recommended that future topics and policy development should be informed by detailed analyses and stakeholder engagement, and really focusing on the emissions-based dispatch feasibility and counterfactual design impacts. And then lastly, WPTF, they proposed deferring the GHG price formation and counterfactual items until further evaluation and operational data are available after EDM goes live. So any questions on any of the summary slides of the comments received from the May working group?
There are currently no questions in the queue.
All right, well, if we go to the next slide, I'll hand things off to Sylvie, Mahir, and Anya for an update on the GHG metrics request.
Thank you, Isabella. I think we can go to the next slide. So stakeholders requested that we report out on the progress that we've made on all of the GHG data and metrics requests to date. So we've taken stock of everything that we've heard since the beginning of the GHG coordination working groups. And as part of that effort, we've also been touching base with specific stakeholders where in cases where we needed more information around the details or the timing or the use cases and prioritizations of the data requests that we've heard. And as a result, we have this high-level summary of what we've heard and the approach towards developing and providing those metrics that have been requested by stakeholders. Through these follow-up discussions and the feedback that we've received, most of the metrics fall into these categories. And either we got feedback that the approaches that I'll go through in just a moment will capture those requests, or that the data being requested is specific to a stakeholder's need and or some regulatory process. And in those cases, we'll continue to work with those stakeholders outside of the working group to ensure that those needs are being addressed. So I'll go through these at a high level, and for most of these discussions, we'll have more details on them in a few slides. But getting started at the top, the first big bucket of requests that we've heard are in the accounting and reporting area. The 2 main priorities that we've heard in this category are double counting and developing an unspecified rate for retail claims. Now, we'll note that we've heard different definitions of what double counting is, both with respect to regulations and from the perspective of stakeholders, and different specifications around what an unspecified rate for retail claims might entail. But overall, what we've heard from stakeholders is that what they're asking for really coalesces around the idea of residual emissions rate. So in developing some sort of residual emissions rate that meets the needs of unique regulations and what stakeholders want, we have two active approaches to developing a metric like that. The first is, sorry, is my audio breaking up? Sorry. Am I good? I'll say yes.
Good to me.
And someone let me know. Yeah? Okay. Someone let me know if it goes out again. So the first of the approaches that you can engage in toward developing some residual emissions rate is to continue to evolve the average emissions rate data that we currently provide through the CAISO website. And on the next slide, I'll go through some of the details that stakeholders have requested that we consider to help in the evolution of that and tailor it to specific regulations. The other approach that we can take is to begin development of the WPTF approach, and we will talk a little bit more about that today as well. The second category is monitoring and assessment of existing GHG design. Within the problem statements use case, we've heard that most of the requests come in fall into the space of developing some sort of cost-benefit analysis on the constraints to limit secondary dispatch. We've received a lot of different and often very specific perspectives on what the appropriate methodology for developing this type of analysis is. We've also heard requests for some initial steps for monitoring an EDAM go live. So on those 2 points, the first step that we need to take that we've taken internally is to make sure that we've vetted all of those requests just for feasibility. But then when it comes to coming up with a methodology, we would like to develop that in the working group process. So in a future working group, we'll discuss those proposed methodologies and hopefully come up with something with the stakeholder community to have in place for EDAM. And some other goals for that might be to put a plan in place for other monitoring goals and get a timeline down for monitoring and evaluation. In the next category, program-specific information. One of the big requests that we've heard from stakeholders is to identify the marginal units for EIM transfers into a GHG area. We've also heard just a general request for marginal data with different ideas behind what the methodology and use case is, but in general, these requests seem to be in support of program-specific information or program-specific goals. So in general, we recommend that stakeholders engage directly with the relevant state rulemakings, as these are all ongoing. And we can continue to talk about the feasibility of looking at this marginal emissions data. Finally, we've seen a lot of requests that offer recommendations around the currently available data that the ISO provides. Much of this seems to be around situational awareness, just a general understanding of what's going on in the market. So I'll note that we've stood up a new process for stakeholders to make requests through CITI. And these CITI requests will be processed on a case-by-case basis. So if there's something that you see within the bucket of currently available data that you think could be useful, you can make that request and we'll set up a process internally to validate that. And my colleague Mahir is here to go over all of the data that we currently provide, as well as some updates on what's new in a few minutes so that you can make those requests where necessary. So first, let me go on to the next slide and talk about the average emissions rate. What we've heard from a lot of stakeholders so far is that many of the requests that I've listed here in the potential variables and metrics column might be accommodated through the average emissions rate or might be accommodated through the WPTF approach. Either way, I wanted to at least take stock and delineate them so that we can have further discussion around what evolving this metric might look like, given that it's currently available, and we can have these discussions immediately. So many of the requests fall into these top 3 lines where a lot of stakeholders have asked for monthly and hourly emissions granularity. That's already provided in the average emissions rate data. It also has total attributed generation, and it includes imports and exports into the EIM area. And I'll note that that's different from imports and exports or transfers within the market, which I'll get to. Many stakeholders have asked for a state or zonal specific metric, and EDAM will facilitate this type of thing because EDAM has added functionality for up to do geographic modeling as opposed to modeling at the BA level. So this is something that we can evolve the metric to capture once EDAM goes live. We saw a few requests for data broken down by injection point or pricing node. So I'll note that there are some technical and legal limitations to our ability to do this and to provide this information publicly. It was also unclear about what the use cases around this were And when we talked to some specific stakeholders offline, it sounded like other items in this list could capture those use cases. So I wanted to put it out here in case there was lingering interest in looking at this information. But if so, let us know and we'll need to discuss further what the use case is and whether or not these technical limitations will impede those goals. Next, demand response. Currently, the emissions tracker, the average emissions rate tracker, and potentially even the WPPF approach captures this information implicitly, but we don't break it out. So it'll look like negative load, or it'll look like something on the supply side. So if we want to break it out, it's something that we can think about in a future iteration. We'd have to develop a methodology for identifying it and what the emissions impact is. And we'd be interested in hearing more about the use case for this, if it's something that is specified by regulators, or if it's something that LSEs are looking at for other purposes. Some stakeholders ask for resource-specific attributions, and this is not something we can provide in publicly available data, but it is available through CMRI. A big request that we saw is to look at the emissions rate relative to base schedules. And this is definitely the biggest step toward evolving a residual emissions rate using the average emissions data that we provide today. So if this is something that the working groups identify as a high priority area, we would need to think through what the appropriate methodology is for breaking down this data relative to base schedules. Finally, we've heard requests to look at bilateral transfers between BAs or between LSCs. Because there's no impact of transfers in a system-wide metric, this is not currently included. But if we start to break down the information on a BA level or something more granular, then this information starts to become pertinent. So should stakeholders want to evolve this data toward more of a residual emissions rate looking metric, we can think about how to make it relevant to BA-specific metrics and come up with an emissions rate for those transfers between BAs. And I'll pause there. I feel like I've been talking for a long time for questions, comments.
There's currently no questions in the queue.
Amazing. In that case, I can hand it over to my colleague Mahir, who's going to provide an overview and an update on other types of metrics that the ISO provides.
Thanks, Sylvie. So I am Mahir from the market analysis team. And let's go to the next slide, please. Before we get into the planned updates to GHG metrics based on stakeholder feedback that Sylvie has just gone over, thought it would be helpful to get a full understanding of full familiarity with the palette of metrics that the ISO does publish. There are mainly publicly available metrics, as well as some non-public metrics that are only available to scheduling coordinators. I will go over each one of these and try to keep it short and sweet, but of course, open to questions on these metrics. Let's go to the next slide, please. The average emissions rate report is a report that we publish monthly and provides reports the average emissions rate for generation across the WEIM footprint, which includes the CAISO. There's also data that reports the average emissions rate for generation attributed to California. The screenshot that I share is a little bit small, apologies for that, but it shows the average emissions rate as well as the generation megawatt hours, imports and export megawatt hours for the WEIM and the emissions that are associated with those generation imports and exports. Similarly, for the attributed average emissions rate, the energy, the megawatt hours, and the emissions associated with those megawatt hours is shown in the report. I include a link to the report, and there are also more details about exactly what is and what is not included in the report. Each of the report has an additional tab that kind of describes the methodology. Let's go to the next slide, please. CAISO Daily Outlook is reporting emissions that are associated with energy that serves CAISO load, and important to note that this is metered energy. There is a link that I provide to where you can find this information, and if you follow that link, there's also more details in one of there's an attachment that describes the details that are included within and the assumptions that are included in coming up with reporting this data. For instance, the rate that's assigned to emissions that are imports. Let's go to the next slide, please. GHG emission tracking report is a report that shows the emissions associated with serving ISO load again, like the Daily Outlook, but this time it's using 5-minute market awards, while the Daily Outlook uses metered energy. There's 4 charts that are shown in the report. The first 2 charts that are on the screen from the top going down show the total emissions to serve ISO load, and it does show the sum of the GHG emissions from internal ISO dispatches as well as imports that are serving the ISO load. Those are the first 2 charts. The third chart shows the emissions from internal ISO dispatches and imports, but by hour. It's an hourly profile. And the 4th chart at the very bottom is another hourly profile, but comparing the hourly profile looking back a number of years, I think it goes until 2017. As a link that's included to this report, and also mentions, the report also describes the assumptions that are included in coming up with these data. Again, for example, the emissions rate that's assigned to imports or for other resource-specific emissions rates. Let's go to the next slide, please. The GHG attributions by fuel type is a report in the monthly market performance report. This shows the percentage of the energy transfers that are attributed to California, GHG attributions to California BAAs. It's broken down by fuel type and given as a percentage value, and it looks back historically for 2 years. Let's go to the next slide, please. Couple more metrics here. The GHG allowance index price is the price that's received from vendors and used in the calculations, such as the GHG bid cap. It's shown for both California and Washington areas. This is available on OASIS, and I provide a link to where you can find these prices. These are prices that are updated daily. Let's go to the next slide, please. OASIS also reports the GHG shadow price for the EIM footprint. This is shown for both the real-time and the 15-minute RTPD market. This price reflects the GHG component of the LMP for the entire EIM footprint. Another way of thinking about this or saying this is that it is the marginal GHG price for each interval in the real-time market. There's the link to where to find these prices as well, and these are updated daily. Let's go to the next slide, please. Those were the publicly available metrics. The GHG attributions that are specific to each resource are not publicly available. These ones are only available to scheduling coordinators through the CMRI system. On CMRI, the GHG attributions reported are for both the 15-minute market as well as the 5-minute RTD market. These results are ultimately what are used to report to CARB and other agencies for compliance with programs that are related to WEIM. Don't include a link here because, as I mentioned, this is only available to participating resource scheduling coordinators. Let's go to the last slide, please. We identified 2 metrics that we plan to provide updates on. For the average emissions rate, we're exploring the breakdown of the report that we currently put out by fuel type, for example, gas, hydro, storage, and so on. And for the marginal emissions rate as well, PISA is exploring a methodology. And for both of these metrics, we plan to report on them in a future session of this working group. That's the last of my slides, and this may be a good opportunity to see if there are any questions.
There are currently no questions in the queue.
Any questions on any of the existing metrics or planned updates to those metrics that Mihir just covered?
Not seeing any in the queue. Just a reminder, everyone, if you're having trouble finding the raise hand function, you can always type in the question in the chat to all participants or myself, and we can read your question aloud. But currently seeing no hands raised.
Yeah, maybe if there's no questions, even if anyone has any feedback on kind of the approaches we proposed for moving forward and feedback on these planned updates to the metrics, that would be great too.
Not currently seeing any in the queue.
All right. All right. Well, then we're going to move the agenda around just a little bit because we are ahead of schedule. So I'm going to turn things over to Anya.
All right. Well, sounds good. I think for the time being, we can move. Actually, we're going to go back a few slides. We're going to go to the Go Live metrics slide, which is right after Mihir's last slide. I'm still seeing slide 36 on my slide. We might need to go back to where we just were.
Scanning slide 29.
Okay, great. Well, Sylvie talked about some of the metric requests and how we've categorized it. Mihir talked about some of the metrics that we'll be producing as a result of the working group feedback. And what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit forward-looking in terms of some of the metrics that we could monitor for Go Live. And in this working group, we've been discussing elements of greenhouse gas design, ranging from price formation, the counterfactual, the GHG net export constraint that are really hard to quantify ahead of Go Live. And key is we don't have the bids in place. We don't know what those bids will look like. And without that, we can't necessarily extrapolate what the results will be. And while the ISO usually creates Go Live metrics internally, we wanted to bring you all into this process to see if this is the right direction and get your feedback. And really with the goal of understanding if these are the right metrics or if you have feedback. So one of the kind of key areas discussed with GHG accounting and design is really around secondary dispatch and quantifying it. And so one of the first metrics we have is really a continuation of tracking what we've been tracking in the WEIM, which is the percentage of transfers serving California and now Washington load that could have potential secondary dispatch. And maybe I'll spend a little bit of time reminding folks what secondary dispatch is and how we can measure it. Secondary dispatch is when there's a higher emitting resource that can potentially backfill to serve demand outside of the GHG regulation area, when the optimization is attributing a lower emitting resource to serve California or Washington demand. And one way that we look for secondary dispatch is to see what was attributed below the counterfactual, meaning what was attributed that was also intended to serve the non-GHG area. But when there's attribution below the counterfactual, it's not always due to leakage. There's three reasons. One is leakage. The second is economic displacement. Another reason could be a decrease in the load forecast. So real time wasn't as hot as expected in the day ahead. And so you can kind of deck resources down. So that's a little bit behind the reason why we're thinking about looking at a metric on secondary dispatch. And the second category of issues we're looking to monitor for Go Live has to do with the net export constraint. This didn't exist previously in the WEIM and was really instituted to respond to stakeholder concerns regarding leakage. And maybe before getting into the metrics themselves, I'll talk about the net transfer constraint or net export constraint. I'll note that it was developed to reduce the potential for leakage. It does ignore contracted capacity so that contracted resources can be fully attributed if they're contracted to the GHG regulation area. It doesn't allow attribution beyond transfer limits of a BAA, or if that BAA is a net importer. It is a static constraint based on the optimal net transfer of the previous market run. And I'll note that we occasionally turn it off. We turn it off for all non-GHG regulation area BAAs for any hour that the BAA, when it overlaps with the GHG area, fails the RSC. And I'll note that anytime you introduce a constraint, it can increase costs. And so some of the metrics proposed for the net transfer constraint really examine how it's used, how useful it's been, and it starts the discussion around probing at the potential cost impacts of the constraint. So first, we'd like to look at the number of intervals the GHG net export constraint binds, which limits the ability to attribute, or in other words, how often is it used and how often is it really limiting the ISO's ability to attribute resources to a greenhouse gas regulation area. The second Go Live metric we'd like to look at related to the net transfer constraint is the number of hours the net transfer constraint is turned off due to an RSC failure for a BAA that overlaps with the GHG regulation area. So how used and useful is it? This can really help us understand if it's being turned off too frequently to be useful. And third, we'd like to look at the percentage of intervals when there was a GHG bid lower than what was attributed when the net transfer constraint was active. So in other words, how many cheaper GHG bids were there behind the constraint? This doesn't necessarily get at the cost impact, but it's a first cut of analysis that might indicate more analysis is needed. So with that, maybe I'll just pause here and see if there's any reactions to some of the metrics I've brought up, or see if there's additional metrics that you'd suggest, and we can discuss those, or you can also include those in your comments.
We currently have a hand raised by Claire.
Sure, go ahead, Claire.
Hey, thank you, Anya. And I didn't weigh in earlier, so some of these points may kind of go back to this. I'm realizing when I look at this, and I don't have a clear idea in my head about what CAISO staff would consider a metric for monitoring versus some of the other versus analysis regarding some of the concerns that have been raised about the counterfactual. And it occurred to me during this slide because, for instance, secondary dispatch. I think to evaluate secondary dispatch, I think we're not only interested in seeing what could be considered secondary dispatch in terms of going below the counterfactual, but the flip side of that is, I think there's some of us, certainly WPTF believes that the constraints that are put in for the counterfactual to prevent secondary dispatch are too broad and too crude. And so I think there's a lot of additional analysis that could be done here that would be based on market metrics to help us assess that. For instance, I would want to know not just what those transfers look like, but what's the breakdown of dispatched resources and emission intensity by fuel type outside of the greenhouse gas California and Washington zones. I'd also be interested in knowing what would have looked different if we had a different counterfactual, if we were doing this on a BAA or an entity-specific basis, as opposed to the entire market footprint outside California. I would have other thoughts around the net export constraint, but I'm wondering, rather than comment on those, whether you could give me some clarity in terms of where you see the boundary between metrics that would be useful for doing future analysis versus future analysis. Sorry if that wasn't clear. Thank you.
No, and I think, there's a lot of areas that your suggestion reaches into, but I'm going to try and respond to it in terms of separating kind of analysis requests versus go live. I think maybe I'll tease out some of the examples that you brought up. So what was attributed based on fuel type, is the metric kind of produced? It's done at a percentage basis, not necessarily a megawatt basis. DMM may have that in their annual report. Maybe I misinterpreted what you were seeking with kind of the fuel type. I think maybe a difference might be when you are introducing a counterfactual, and that might fit more under kind of a bigger analysis request and may or may not be feasible. Like that example of having a counterfactual at a BAA level wouldn't necessarily be a go live kind of how is the market performing, but rather a request around what could be the potential modeling difference if you had a different structure for the counterfactual. So we might need to review these on a case-by-case basis, but I'd also invite our market analysis team to come and kind of provide their thoughts, since they're the ones kind of performing this analysis. So I don't know if we can promote Abhishek if he has any feedback, or if Mihir, you want to respond to that as well. And this might be something that we just might have to discuss on a case-by-case basis, but go live monitoring is really what functionality is in the market. Moving forward, and analysis might be kind of some more counterfactual examples, but maybe we can review those in the comments as well.
There are no further questions or comments in the queue.
All right. Well, since we're somewhat ahead of time, let's go ahead and jump down to the section on the non-price-based approaches, and then maybe after this presentation, we'll go to the regulatory assistance projects survey results. So let's go ahead and move to our next slide. So in our working group, we've had a number of discussions around, what the ISO market can do in those cases where a state doesn't have a price on carbon, and instead there are climate policies that the state has in place. And the way I'd like to kind of frame some of this discussion is, going back to the problem statement of what we're trying to solve. What data do we have to support the problem statement, kind of the framework that we set up as a working group early on in this process, and then talk about some suggested next steps. So let's go to the next slide and our problem statement. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but again, the umbrella portion is really focused on, having a way for the market to account for climate policies as well as clean energy goals. And I think the subparts of the problem statement we're really looking to see if there were gaps when there was a declining cap, a gap with potentially optimizing a portfolio that has to meet a given emissions target, or for those states that have both a declining cap and price on carbon. And let's move to the next slide. Just some observations about our collective problem statement here is that it's unique in that, it's forward-looking. We're not necessarily able to do analysis on it backwards looking, and it's really based on regulatory and voluntary objectives. Our problem statement also included some solutions, and it really relies on state, stakeholder, and ISO coordination on those ultimate solutions. Let's move to the next slide. In terms of the data that we have, we don't necessarily have data, but we do have compliance entity feedback in terms of what works for compliance entities to meet their state requirements. And throughout this working group, we heard some potential solutions, including a kind of, call it in-market emission constrained dispatch approach, as well as an out-of-market, more reporting approach or accounting and reporting approach. And we'll note that, a lot of state climate policies are still under development in terms of refining some of those regulations in terms of the requirements and don't necessarily dictate a solution. But I will note we did hear Commissioner Tani come to the working group and share her perspective that for Oregon, an in-market solution would be needed to meet 2030 goals. I'll note that through this working group and through comments collected, we've received broad support in pursuing the accounting and reporting approach, and really limited support for further exploration of the emission constrained dispatch approach. Next slide. So in terms of what path to pursue, we'd like to suggest that in the near term we move the accounting and reporting approach to policy and implementation, and have workshops to really kind of dig into some of the details in terms of what might be needed. And in the long term, just because we have some lead time in terms of Oregon's 2030 goals, kind of a need for additional analysis to see how this interacts with the current price-based approach, and also to allow regulation to further develop prior to beginning a policy, we're planning on kind of putting a pause on the kind of emission constrained dispatch or in-market solution. Next slide. I think some of the issues we'll need to flesh out in potential workshops for the policy and implementation phase. I'm listing them here, not necessarily to debate them, but to kind of preview them, and also to get your feedback to understand if there are topics that are missing, and really seeking those to make sure that we can make the best use of everyone's time when we look at kind of the implementation details with the accounting and reporting approach. For some of the policy conversations, we're anticipating that we'll need confirmation of the reporting structure, recognizing that we're also going to need to have flexibility at the LSE level with regards to kind of changing some of the attributes in terms of what's collected and what the report produces by state or reporting entity for those state or voluntary or corporate goals. We'll need policy discussions around developing an approach for an LSE residual emissions rate, and really developing an approach for null power. I also recognize that these are LSE frameworks subject to state regulation, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. And then I think another category for us to explore as a group is really some of the implementation topics that touch on the ISO's kind of IT systems, and from our preliminary analysis, kind of talking with our internal SMEs, some of the areas that are challenges with our current IT systems that create challenge in producing these reports are associating LSEs with generating resources ahead of the day-ahead market, and then also associating load for reporting purposes. And then I'll just note, we'll also need to talk about confidentiality and access issues when it comes to what's public, what the LSEs are accessing, what states are accessing, etc. Next slide. So I'll maybe just kick this slide off by reemphasizing that the approach was developed to support load serving entities and states with climate policies not based on a price, and to support voluntary and corporate GHG reporting programs. But we are not planning on making these reports available where there are already state GHG reporting frameworks unless it's requested by that state. So for example, it won't be available to California LSEs since they're already subject to the CEC's GHG reporting requirements and may have additional GHG reporting requirements as a result of SB 253 and SB 261. Next slide. So where are we going from here? This last slide touches on just a draft timeline of some of the next steps associated with moving the accounting and reporting framework further, noting that, you know, in our 2022 to 2023 to 4 timeline, we've really been in kind of this working group phase, suggesting that this fall we have a issue paper for the accounting and reporting approach, and then starting workshops to really refine that approach later this year. And then, as I mentioned, that in-market solution, kind of pressing pause on that, allowing time for regulations to further develop. And with that, I'll pause for questions. It looks like we've got a question in the queue.
We have first in the queue, Claire.
Yeah, thanks again, Anya. Claire Brydenich, Western Power Trading Forum. Can we go back one slide to the applicability slide? Yeah, so I had a couple of concerns here that I wanted to flag early. One is, I guess in my mind, or in WPTF's mind, this accounting and reporting approach is intended as a voluntary framework. And it's wouldn't necessarily be imposed on LSEs, but the flip side of that is I don't think we should assume that LSEs can't participate if they want to, and I think it's too early to presume that entities in states with carbon pricing programs might not want to avail themselves of this framework. Further, it's not clear to me that it's up to the state to say whether or not an entity can participate in a reporting framework that is optional in a market that they're a participant or not. I mean, yes, the state could try to say that in their regs, but if they haven't said so and an entity wants to participate, I think they ought to be able to participate. Now, obviously, if an entity is subject to state regulation, the way they participate may be subject to that regulation, and we'll have to accommodate this. But I would hate to see us say this can't be used by load serving entities in states with carbon pricing, or it can't be used by entities unless the state themselves says they have to participate in the program. So just wanted to flag that, and hopefully it's something we can get into as we move into the discussions during the policy initiative phase. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire. I think ultimately the kind of purpose here is wanting to make sure that we're not putting out information that conflicts with regulatory reporting or some of those state objectives. But thank you for your point, and we can discuss that further in workshops. Thank you.
There are currently no other questions in the queue.
Okay, well, running pretty ahead of schedule. Maybe just a quick check-in off the cuff. Maybe I'll check with Carl and Andrew if you'd like to go now, or if we'd like to take a 10-minute break and then begin your presentation after the break.
Hi, Anya. This is Carl. I think the 10-minute break is a good idea. I don't believe Commissioner Tawny is is on. But we may, just because we're early, we may be without her regardless, but let's give it 10 minutes and see if she comes.
Okay, sounds good. All right, I'll turn things back to you, Christina. Thanks.
Thanks, Anya. We'll now take a 10-minute break and come back at approximately 2:10. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We will now be hearing from Andrew Valenas, Carl Linville, and Commissioner Tani on a regulatory assistance project on the state greenhouse gas survey. So I'll turn it over to them now.
Hi, this is Carl Linville. I will be primarily delivering this. Andrew's available to jump in if necessary, and Commissioner Tani may be joining us in a bit for a little bit of a deeper dive into any questions you might have about Oregon. But with that, next slide, please. This is a document prepared primarily by Andrew Valenas, guided by Doug Howe and Andrew, working together with regulators to come up with some common questions that we thought would be helpful for the California ISO and for SPP's Markets Plus to have on how states viewed various issues related to implementing the accounting and tracking, as well as reporting and tracking, as well as other issues associated with the GHG metrics and so forth. With that effort, Andrew prepared a document that summarizes the findings of working with these states over a couple of months, and we'll present that to you here today. Next slide, please. Overall, first of all, these are initial perspectives. So we worked with the states to get the most complete answers that we could in a time that would be most useful to the California ISO, to Markets Plus, and to all of you stakeholders of these processes. These perspectives were formulated by something known as the PUC MOU group, or the PUC MOU GHG subgroup, which consists of commissioners and staff brought forward by various states that are trying to implement GHG policies that are affected by how this GHG rule is implemented most directly. Those states include Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington. As it notes here, these commissions have jointly agreed to work together and assist each other in developing multi-state solutions for their respective clean energy programs. The desire is to ensure that they can meet their statutory requirements within their respective states, and that also that they can coordinate with one another to make the tracking and reporting as uniform as possible, while still being able to meet the various states' needs and goals. This information that I'm presenting today does not reflect the views of California or Nevada, who did not specifically provide answers to these questions at this time. As we know, Nevada is working through a proceeding addressing these questions, and so that'll be forthcoming as that proceeding goes along. And as I noted initially, these perspectives are initial perspectives from the states at the time that we prepared this. Next slide, please. First of all, with respect to double counting of emissions, it's agreed by all states, should be minimized to the greatest extent possible. This is driving the interest in states for uniformity in how emissions are tracked and reported through Western energy markets. However, I also acknowledge through these conversations that statutory definitions and limitations may at times make complete uniformity challenging across all states. Next slide, please. With respect to non-price program tracking and accounting. There was no strong opposition to the Western Power Trading Forum proposal for tracking and reporting. Colorado and New Mexico affirmed that the tracking and reporting solution is likely to be sufficient for their needs to comply with their respective programs. Oregon, on the other hand, said that tracking and reporting may be sufficient in the near term, but as noted in the earlier discussion today, in the medium or long term, there may need to be an emissions constrained dispatch solution for them, in their opinion. Washington is currently a price state. Passage of Washington Initiative 2117 would repeal the Climate Commitment Act and bar state agencies from implementing cap and trade programs. In the perspectives document that accompanies, I believe was distributed to all of you, and if it was not, you can ask us and we'd be happy to share it with you. There was an error there that the repeal of the Climate Commitment Act could put Washington in the same position as Oregon with respect to needing an emissions constrained dispatch solution. But at this time, Washington is not ready to say that that could be necessary if that initiative were repealed. So that we'll have to amend that sentence in the perspectives document itself. Next slide, please. With respect to RPS programs, renewable energy certificates, and null power, Colorado, the state statute specifically requires RECs to be retired for compliance with GHG programs. In Oregon, the statute is interpreted as specifically restricting the PUC from requiring RECs to be retired for compliance with GHG programs. In Washington, there are two different statutory requirements in play. The CCA, where the energy bears underlying generators characteristics regardless of the REC status, and CETA, primary compliance requires RECs to be retired, unbundled, and RECs are allowed, but only as an alternative compliance obligation and only until 2045. Given the different statutes and approaches, the group is still discussing how the treatment of RECs and null power, or what they, people don't always use the term null power, some have an alternative term, how they affect GHG compliance in their respective states. Next slide, please. With respect to energy storage, all the states generally thought the Western Power Trading Forum proposal appeared reasonable. The kind of questions that folks had with regard to the proposal included: how would the timing of charging be determined? How will the resources used for charging be determined? And who will make those determinations? And last slide, please. This is just a summary of what most of you already know, but just in case it's useful, we included it as a reference document, and it's included in the perspectives paper itself as well. And with that, I would invite Andrew, or I don't know if Commissioner Tani has arrived or not. No, it doesn't appear so.
Tani is here. So thanks,
Okay.
thanks for joining. And just
Okay.
a big thank you to the Regulatory Assistance Project for putting together both this benchmarking, but also engaging in these conversations to kind of better understand where states are and where they may be. But I'll pause there and see if Andrew or Commissioner Tani want to add to your statements, Carl.
I would just echo your thanks to the Regulatory Assistance Project in helping the states really understand each other's regulatory constructs around these issues. It's taken some real time and focus on detail. So just real appreciation to Andrew and Carl.
Yeah, nothing else from me. I think Carl took care of it. Thanks.
I think that's all we have, Anya.
All right, well,
Open
maybe
for
we'll just
questions.
pause for a moment, open it up to the group as well to see if any working group members have any questions or wanted to dig further into any of the material.
There are currently no hands raised in the queue and no comments or questions in the chat.
All right, well, a quiet Monday in GHG. I'll give it another moment in case folks do have questions, but a huge appreciation for the work that the Regulatory Systems Project has done and coming to present in this forum, and Commissioner Tawney for your time and in being available as a resource to answer any questions. All right. Not hearing any questions, I'll turn things back to Christina and extend another thanks to wrap.
Yep. Thank you for the opportunity. Bye.
Thanks. All right, Christina, if we could jump to the next step slide, and if we could go one more in advance. One more slide, Christina. There we go, thank you. All right, so comments on today's working group discussion will be due by end of day August 12th. So we'll get a template posted out there on the initiative webpage this week. And then our next working group, we are targeting September, and so it'll probably be mid to late September. So we'll send a notice in the daily briefing once a date is confirmed. And then again, as always, if you have a presentation you'd like to give or you'd like to request to present, please email isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com so we can help coordinate that. And a link to the initiative webpage is provided here below on this slide, just for all presentation materials and previous working group materials. So with that, I will turn things over to Christina. I think she has a couple housekeeping reminders for us or kind of save the date items, and then we'll go ahead and close out. But thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your participation, and thank you to Carl, Andrew, and Commissioner Tawney for joining us today as well.
Thanks, Isabella. Now for some announcements. For insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. Here you can see the latest post regarding the Western Energy Imbalance Market Governing Body adopting a new name, and another one regarding the July 2024 heat wave. Next, we'd like to announce the new policy initiatives timeline. The ISO has launched this timeline to give stakeholders an overview of ongoing policy initiatives, and it really offers details such as the initiative status, timelines, and the current phase of the stakeholder engagement process that we're currently in. Updates will be made weekly and can be found on the policy initiatives landing page. For more information, feel free to always email us at isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. And lastly, we'd like to remind you that registration is open for the 2024 Stakeholder Symposium, and you can visit the event website linked here to visit for additional information or to register as well. And with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage. Thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
The conference is now over. You may now disconnect. Have a wonderful day.